Welcome to the fifth and final training video put out by Reach the City Ministries on being ready for the post-crisis window of opportunity for the gospel that we're soon going to enjoy when restrictions slowly begin to lift. In this clip, we're going to look at the dreaded question, what if, after all this, and things are eased, and the virus comes back? We're confronted with the same problem again, and there's still no solution. Which is the harder trial? When cancer comes the first time, or when it returns? When a traumatic, painful situation is experienced, or when we're about to face the very same thing again and it's touching all of our buttons and raising all of those alarms and issues that we had buried. I think most of us as shepherds and leaders realize that it's when something comes back a second or more time that it's often a harder trial, a more difficult test, and an even greater temptation to despair. So the thing I wanted to mention is the great shepherding task we're going to face is when something returns, it's going to be even more traumatic than this virus was the first time. So what can we do? Where can we go if we're needing to have some biblical strength and guidance, if we want to equip our people, if we want to help them make it through the second time they're going to go through this, a more severe test? Thankfully, in the Bible, we have a book specially written to New Testament Christians who are going to be facing persecution not the first time, but the second time, and they were having a more extreme reaction. Let me just read in the book of Hebrews that it's their second time, because the writer says, "Remember the former days when, after being enlightened, you endured a great conflict of sufferings, partly by being made a public spectacle through approaches and tribulations, and partly becoming sharers with those who were so treated. You showed sympathy to the prisoners and accepted joyfully the seizure of your property, knowing that you yourselves have a better possession and a lasting one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence in the current crisis, which is a great reward." So again, it's the second time this is coming, and the book of Hebrews is written to address this very scenario to help us. One of the things a second time around kind of trial, which is more extreme, one of the ways it impacts us is it tempts us to relapse backwards, to go back to old habits, old ways of dealing things, old beliefs, even pre or non-Christian thinking and responses to life. And as pastors and shepherds, that's the last thing we want our people to do. So you'll find in the book of Hebrews some very valuable things to help ward that off. First of all, the writer reminds the believers that the reward is worth it. There's so much about faith, about enduring to the end and coming to that lasting city and that eternal reward, joining the great company of saints. The other thing is, it's not worth the price of relapsing. The writer outlines the terrors and horrific position someone is in when they've thrown away Christ and relapsed back into their old belief system. Problems we see in the book of Hebrews are we find groups of believers going into immorality. They deal with stress and suffering by pleasure seeking. We find another issue of a root of bitterness where people get soured and bitter, and then they start being rebellious and conflicting with their own leaders and failing to practice love for one another. So conflict, loss of affection and love, and then they isolate, they withdraw from fellowship. All these things we can anticipate happening to the people we love and shepherd, and therefore we can bring the prescription, we can bring this helpful biblical answer to address that worst case scenario. I'm going to close with reading two very relevant passages that speak to not just we leaders and what we do for the people, but what our people need to do for one another. And this is the major teaching point, the major response we need to shepherd our people towards. Instead of isolating, there's a very important task we desperately need each other to do. Let me read in Hebrews 3, where it says in verse 12, "Take care, brethren, Take care that there not be in any one of you an evil, unbelieving heart in falling away from the living God. Don't go there, in other words. Instead, encourage one another. Day after day, as long as it's still called a day, lest your heart be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. The truth is, we either get there together, we either get through this second wave together, or we don't get there at all. Whether it's relapsing, bitterness and conflict, immorality, walking away from the faith entirety, these are things that are prevented that stem from the hardness of heart and an evil, unbelieving heart and falling away from God, all from a lack of vital one anothering, encouraging one another in crisis. So as much as we need that now in this current thing, we're going to triply need it in the next wave to come. I'll share one final passage that very brilliantly sums up the core of what's being advocated in this most relevant book when we face something a second time and we know full well how bad it's going to be. And we're tempted to rebel, walk away, and relapse back into old things. Here's what it says in chapter 10, verses 19 through 25. Therefore, brethren, since we have confidence to enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way which he inaugurated for us through the veil. The strength of what Christ did for us on the cross, how we're justified, and we have access to God, and let's use that access. Let's go to him instead of going inward and withdrawing from him. Let's go up. Let's take it to our Abba Father in the power of the Spirit, our high priest Jesus who loves us, who's compassionate. Let's enter that guilt-free, justified way straight to the throne of God. Let us draw near with a sincere heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. We are still clean. That guilt of failure and guilt of letting God down, we can leave it at the cross and stand in the clothed in the righteousness of Christ. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. Getting in the Word and be reacquainted with what God promises to those who endure. And let us consider how to stimulate each other to love and good deeds. Let's spur each other on. Let's bring out the best in each other. Let's get creative. Let's think of inventive ways to extend the kingdom, to proclaim the gospel, to penetrate our culture with Christ and his power and authority. Not forsaking the assembling together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and that all the more as you see the day drawing near. What's the job of the church in this time of second wave, third wave crisis? It's to give each other that desperately needed encouragement and administer that grace back and forth indirectly from Jesus to each of us through each other. And in that we're strengthened, we outlast the trial, we can make it through it together.